Recording is started. Everyone, you ready, Steve?
Yeah, I'm going to mute until you introduce me.
Okay. Okay, going to go ahead and start the broadcast.
The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Welcome, everyone. You are signed on to the Rotronic Instrument Corporation webinar, How to Map a Warehouse. And this is a series of actually 3 cGMP monitoring and mapping webinars that we're going to be producing over the next couple of months. With the mission behind them is to help you maintain compliance and product quality in controlled and regulated environments. Everyone who registered for the webinar will receive a copy of the slides and a link to the recording. We provide this in 2 ways. The first way is via email, which comes about 24 hours after the live broadcast here. And we'll also post it on the Rotronic website under the Rotronic Academy section. And this website is rotronic-usa.com. Everyone who's signed on here today is in listen-only mode, and that means you cannot speak to us directly with your computer or your phone, but we do want to have interaction with you. And the way to ask a question or to make a comment is to use the questions panel, which you should see in the lower portion of your control panel. As a question comes to mind, or if you have a comment, just go ahead and type it in there. We'll have 2 Q&A sessions during this webinar, the first one mid-webinar and then one at the end. And you don't have to wait for the Q&A session to type in your question. As it comes to mind, go ahead and type it in so you don't forget it, and we'll make sure we queue those up for our subject matter expert during one of those 2 sessions. Once again, this webinar is being recorded, and it will be made available to everybody who registered for the webinar, and it will be also made available on demand. Another thing I want to point out is in the control panel, if you look at the lower portion, there's a section called Handouts. We've got 5 handouts there for you that are all about mapping. So feel free to download those directly, and anytime you can just download them right to your computer. This webinar is presented and produced by Rotronic Instrument Corporation. And if you don't know Rotronic, Rotronic manufactures measurement instruments for parameters like humidity, temperature, dew point, differential pressure, and a few more. And we also offer a universal monitoring system for regulated environments. And we don't talk about these products during this webinar other than what I just said. So, and we have one pitch at the end also. But during the webinar, it's educational, so we don't talk about the products. But of course, if you have questions about the products or you want to learn more about Rotronic, we'd be delighted to hear from you. Just log on to the website, give us a phone call, or find your regional manager, and we'll be glad to engage with you that way. Speaking today, my name is Bruce McDuffie. I'm with the Rotronic Marketing Department, and I'll be your moderator throughout the webinar today. And Steve Chanal is your subject matter expert. Little background on Steve. He has more than 30 years of experience working in the pharmaceutical industry. And Steve joined Rotronic in 2011 as a regional sales manager. And he was since promoted to lead the Rotronic Mapping Services Division. And prior to that, Steve held positions with BioQuell and Getinga as the validation manager. Welcome, Steve.
Thanks, Bruce.
So folks, before we get started into the material, we'd just like to get to know the audience a little bit. And this is interesting for us. And a lot of times for folks out there watching the webinar, you like to know who else is out there. So I have a poll question for you. First question is, what is your industry? Go ahead and choose the industry where you work. And if it's other, if you don't mind and you don't mind sharing, go ahead and just type other, what that industry is, in the question panel. And it gives us an idea of the good cross section. Looks like most of the folks are in pharma today. I'll go ahead and close the poll, and I'll share the results with everyone. So by far, we've got pharma or biotech, a few consulting folks and a few others there. And one other question to get to know the audience. This helps us with the presentation as well. What is your level of mapping knowledge? Just select one of those that best fits. Are you an expert? You know enough to get the job done? Just getting started? Or you use a GPS instead of a map? If you pick that last one, you might be in the wrong place here today. Or you have a good sense of humor, one of those. Give it a few more seconds here. Close the poll and share the results. Most folks, the majority, Steve, know enough to get the job done. Few experts out there too. Okay, I'll hide the results, and then Steve, I'm going to turn it over to you to share with the audience what we're covering and to get started.
Thanks again, Bruce, and welcome everyone. Today in the webinar, we're going to do a little overview about conducting a warehouse temperature or a temperature and humidity mapping. These concepts can be applied to other parts of a building space as well, production areas, clean rooms, etc. We will talk about the current guidelines, preparing protocols, conducting the mapping, and some tips and strategies. Bruce, can you turn the slide for me? I have an issue here.
Yep. Whoops, sorry.
First, let's take a look at some of the regulations and guidelines that exist for the pharmaceutical and healthcare industries. If your industry is not regulated or these regulations don't apply to your industry, it's still good to review them to ensure that your results have a solid methodology behind them. And from the poll that Bruce did, it looks like everybody's familiar with the pharmaceutical industry. Of course, these are just some of the guidelines that exist, and we'll highlight some of the main ideas from those guidelines. These guidelines are readily available online. If you have difficulty in finding these guidelines, give somebody at Rotronic a call and we'll point you in the right direction. We seem to be messed up here. I apologize. Okay, we got it straight. Okay, as many of you know, the Pharmacopoeia is a nonprofit organization. It sets the standards that the Food and Drug Administration enforce. And this is enforceable in the US, and in fact, more than 140 countries use these guidelines. The USP Chapter 1079 covers and describes good storage and distribution practices to ensure that drug products reach the end user with quality intact. USP clearly states drug product storage areas are required to maintain the product temperature between the limits as defined on the product label. Many times at Rotronic we're asked what should the warehouse temperature be, or what temperature ranges are acceptable. And of course the guidelines don't give you an exact temperature or humidity that your space should be at, but really what you should ask yourself is, what temperature or humidity is acceptable for my product. The USP has Chapter 1118, monitoring devices, time and temperature and humidity. And this guideline provides background on the science and technology of temperature and humidity monitoring. This is a really good resource if you need to know more about the different types of monitoring devices, as well as the validation of those devices. For those of you who have to ship to the EU, the European Commission guideline for good distribution practice of medicinal products for human use is a guideline that assists distributors in conducting their activities. This guideline also provides information about suitable and adequate storage conditions. As the title states, it also covers beyond the storage of goods and covers the entire distribution chain. The EU guideline states An initial temperature mapping exercise should be carried out on the storage area before use under representative conditions. It's pretty clear that in the EU, simply installing a few temperature sensors and the storage area is not going to suffice. You'll have to prove with some scientific evidence with number of loggers, the types, and the placement of sensors, and any kind of permanent system that you have installed. And then we have the World Health Organization, or WHO. Everybody kind of knows it as WHO. This is actually has excellent material, not only for guidelines, but it also tells you how to plan and conduct a warehouse mapping. Some of the presentation that you'll see today is drawn from that resource, and if you have a lot of questions on just how to navigate through a temperature mapping, I would definitely start with the WHO guidance. It's really an excellent guideline. And finally, the most asked about regulating body at Rotronic is what the FDA has to say about warehouse mapping. And as with keeping with the tradition of the FDA, they say very little, but what is stated is pretty straightforward. Storage of drug products under appropriate conditions of temperature, humidity, and light so that the identity, strength, quality, and purity of the drug products are not affected. So with the overview of all these guidelines, you can tell that the EU guidelines, they provide a lot more detail for the quality management system and the building requirements than perhaps the FDA does. The WHO guideline provides much more detail about the how and why of the temperature mapping. And the USP has good information about the science and device types available. And as you can tell, following just one guideline, it may not cover all the issues for your product environmental storage system, but even if your industry is not regulated, reviewing these documents will definitely provide a better insight into warehouse temperature mapping. I can tell one thing for sure is that what's important to any regulator or approver is that there are sound scientific results provided from good, logical, and documented protocols. And I think I'm going to hand it over to Bruce now, and I believe that Bruce has another poll for you to participate in.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. We have two polls just to get our arms around the regulations and where you guys have challenges. First question is, which guidelines or regulations do you follow? And you can choose more than one on this poll. Choose as many as you follow. We'll give it a few seconds. It may take a few moments of thought. The results are coming in. Thanks again, everyone, for sharing. We hope you find these polls useful and kind of interesting. Give it a few more seconds. Anyone out there? Yep, a few more folks coming in. Last chance. 3, 2, 1. And you can see the results. Good distribution there, huh, Steve?
Yeah, it is. A lot more of the EU than you would think.
Yeah. Okay, thanks, everyone. One other question for you, and this one is, what are your biggest challenges? What are your biggest challenges with regulations? And again, you can choose one or all. Multiple choices here. Biggest challenges. This one, I'll give it a few extra moments because it takes a little more thought, I think. I guess I should have put one in there, Steve, that said I have no challenges. That person probably wouldn't have come to the webinar. Give it a few more seconds.
That were true for me.
No challenges. Either they're a genius or they're lying. Give it a few more seconds. It looks like most folks are done voting. Last chance. Closing the poll, sharing the results. Pretty good mix there. Looks like the biggest one is interpreting the guidance. There you go, Steve. Not a big surprise there, huh?
No, not really.
Thanks, everyone, again for sharing that information with us. And with that, Steve, let's go ahead in and talk about space assessment.
Okay, thanks, Bruce. Here at Rotronic, we always start with any project with a review of the mapping space. We receive the available building drawings and survey the area by walking through it. And the questions that need to be reviewed and asked are, is there HVAC? There are still warehouses, believe it or not, that don't have complete HVAC systems. So is there heat? Is there air conditioning? Many facilities have heat but no AC, especially in northern regions. I know we just completed a temperature mapping not this past summer, and there was no AC in the facility. And I can tell you that the people that worked in this facility were very happy for us to document exactly how hot it got. And at the end of the day, eventually the company had to put in some type of better control, and it made for a much happier workforce, I can tell you that much. Another important step in the assessment is to identify the heat or the heat loss areas, such as doorways, racks against exterior walls, HVAC vents, fans, etc. You want to look for things that are going to change the airflow that occurs in and around the product. And I always recommend doing this before beginning any project, even before beginning the protocols. And the reason for doing that is that the project, it's simply to know, what you're up against. And this can also affect the protocols a lot, because you'll need to identify these areas of concern. And of course, if you can do that ahead of time, it also helps to limit the protocol revisions. The heat affected areas can affect the number of sensors required, and it may alter the expectations of the mapping. So you should consider these things, and even consider moving items to other areas or making changes to the facility before you begin the mapping. It's also a good idea to consider the final report before starting the mapping. What are my expectations from the mapping? What will I gain from a mapping? The temperature mapping is sometimes performed simply because we need to, but performing a warehouse mapping can take a lot of time and effort. So at the end of the day, a temperature mapping project should deliver a good, sound mapping plan along with solid verified data, and all of that will help to document that you're delivering a quality product. I'm going to turn it back over to Bruce again for another quick poll.
Okay, yeah, this is our last poll, folks, so you want to make sure you get in on this one. This is an easy one. What type of space do you map? And you can only select one in this, so just select the one that's most common that you map. Is it a regulated warehouse, an unregulated warehouse, a storage room, a chamber, or something else? One might assume that you're mapping warehouses because of the title of this webinar, but from the results coming in, it's not a good assumption. It's like just about everyone has voted. Excuse me. Last chance. Okay, closing the poll. And you can see the results. Warehouses, almost as many chamber mappings as regulated warehouses. And then storage rooms and probably a few others. Okay, good. You're in the right place. I'll go ahead and close the poll and give it back to Steve to talk about preparing the protocol. Steve?
Thanks, Bruce. Solid protocol preparation is a very important step. Believe it or not, many times I see this skipped and people just jump right into a mapping. But a well-written protocol makes the creation of the final report a lot easier. And a well-written protocol with a few simple edits can become the main body of the final report. So many times it's not a lot of wasted time trying to make a solid protocol before you begin. You should keep the protocol as simple and as practical and targeted as possible. Don't elaborate beyond the scope of the mapping. For example, don't add details about proposed recommendations for storage locations for a mapping that you haven't even conducted yet. That really belongs in the final report, and your protocol should stick to proposed locations and your reasons for those locations. Logger orientation and placement SOPs should also be included. An example of that might be to check that the logging indicator is lit, telling you that there's an active logging condition. You may or may not include all of this in your protocol. For instance, you may find that there's a need for, or there is no need for a glossary. But I would like to highlight a few important items in your protocol that you wouldn't really want to miss. An approval page and some type of change control history is very important. Even if this would be a one-off study, it's a good idea to put the change control history in the document. It just shows that you're following recommended practices, even if you never revisit the document. Describing the installation to be mapped ensures that the reader understands exactly what is to be mapped. The rationale used is very important. Why will the logger be placed in those locations? Why will it be performed at that time of the year? These are important questions that your rationale should answer. Define the scope and purpose of the mapping study. Is it temperature and humidity study? Will another study at the next seasonal temperature extreme be performed? Will these studies be compared? Defining the scope clearly can also help the mapping team or the individual stay focused on the purpose of the study. What are the objectives or reasons for the study? Knowing why the study passed or failed is important and may play a part in any recommendation for changes that the report may provide. And then the methodology, it really becomes the most important and the largest part of the body of the protocol. It should include information on the logger selection, mapping team selection, surveying of the site, determining and the documenting of the logger locations, conducting the mapping, and the collection and download of the data. The methodology contains probably 75% of the protocol when you get done. So it's a really important thing to make sure it's all spelled out and that someone for an approver or regulator gets a really good feel of exactly how you got things done. And finally, an annex section can be added for any kind of additional reports or data that's generated. And some of the guidelines we discussed earlier explain in more detail about the protocols and the final report documentation requirements. But what I would like to point out here is there are a few important items not stressed in the guidelines. Although the guidelines do mention special calculations such as the MKT calculation, you should look for monitoring systems and equipment that provide those calculations in the device or software. All of that can be a huge time saver, especially if the software can calculate, automatically calculate or parse data for your reports. Manually calculating this data in external spreadsheets, as I'm sure you all know, can be really time-consuming and at times frustrating. So I would say definitely leverage the reporting system to provide things like graph generation, alarm statistics, export file compatibility, and anything else that would enhance or support your data. It's definitely a plus. And the more complete, professional, and cleaner your data reports are, the fewer questions may be raised about the data by your reviewers and approvers. And Bruce, I'm going to turn it back over to you for some questions that seem to be coming in.
Yeah, Steve, we got a few questions coming in. Katie, could you share what's coming into the queue?
Our first question is, guidelines talk about drug product. How about raw materials and intermediates of APIs?
Yeah, in our experience, that's considered, ultimately it's considered a component of the final product. So I would say yes, you would have to make sure that the storage conditions for those items are good as well, as good as your storage at a minimum.
Our next question is, when to perform space assessment during commissioning IQ or OQ?
Like I said earlier, I like to do it before you begin anything, just because you can tell what you're up against. But there are times when people write the protocols or they have pre-existing protocols, and so they'll dive right in and not do the assessment. However, if you do that, it's okay, but more than likely you're going to have those issues show up during or after your mapping.
Our last question is, what is the guidance with remapping?
It depends on the nature of the reason that you had to remap, but if you did, I would include that your original mapping and the reason for the remapping. So I would definitely reference it, and you really probably need, depending on what the problem is, but usually you have to remap the entire thing. If it's a situation where maybe just one logger, there was a failure at one particular point or two particular points, then I would say, perhaps you don't need to do a remapping, you just need to show that that data had a problem and try to use loggers that are nearby or some other methodology to prove that even though that particular logger wasn't there, your overall results are unaffected.
That's all we have for questions at this time.
Okay.
Oh, wait, sorry, more are coming in. Here's one more for you. Sorry about that. Will you be going over MKT calculations?
I won't in this webinar. For those, I guess I'll just quickly go over what MKT is. Maybe that's the best way to handle that. And MKT stands for mean kinetic temperature, and it's a tool to help determine the overall temperature effect on products during storage. What it does is that it provides a single temperature value, and that temperature value is equivalent to the effects of temperature variations over a period of time. So as an example, I'll just, of course these aren't real numbers, I'll just pull them out of thin air. So an example might be that you have product in storage in a freezer for 2 hours at 32 degrees Fahrenheit, and then you pull that out of the freezer and you let it sit in your storage area for 4 hours at 50 degrees Fahrenheit. Once the calculation is done, it will take that 2 hours and that 4 hours and say, well, over the 6 hours of time, it's equivalent to, let's just say 40 degrees Fahrenheit. You can go to at the end we'll have some resources where you can look on the Rotronic website, and also it's out there on, you can Google it, and I think it's even in Wikipedia, and I believe it's accurate. Any other questions?
Yeah, let's go ahead and keep going with the questions, Katie. I see some coming in here as we answer the others. You there, Katie? We lose you?
Oh, sorry. I don't know what happened. Our next question comes from Midou, asking, after the initial mapping, how often do you have to repeat?
Good question. In fact, it's a question everybody asks. Typically, the temperature mapping for warehouse storage area is done at 2 times in the year, your most extreme heat temperature and the coolest time of the year. So it's quite often, temperature mappings are done in July and August, or done for the winter in February and January, being the coldest months. You really need to check for your area. And then it's done each time at that time of year. Now the question is, well, do I need to do that every year? And the safe bet is to say yes, it is the best way to go. However, it all comes back to your product and how your product's stored. So there is no easy answer on that.
Let's take one more question, Katie, then we'll go back into the second half of the presentation.
Dwayne asks, is there software package that can input warehouse layout, HVAC, or physical, and split out a placement plan for the loggers?
Can you ask that question one more time, Katie? I'm sorry. It's just that
It's okay.
I didn't catch the last part of it. I heard the software.
Is there a software package that can input the warehouse layout with the HVAC and the physical layout of the warehouse, and then spit out a placement plan for the loggers? So is there a software that will tell you where to put the loggers if you put in your warehouse layout and your HVAC system layout?
Not that I'm aware of. It comes down to airflow, but it also, the problem is you can't just look at the HVAC, because yes, you could determine some airflow that way. Fortunately, you have a lot of heat loss through doorways, the outside temperature, your seasonal conditions. So unfortunately, I'm not aware of one.
Maybe we should invent one, Steve.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Right.
Thanks for those questions, folks. Keep them coming. We have one more Q&A session here at the end of the webinar. So great questions. And again, keep them coming. Just type them in when they come to mind. And with that, Steve, let's go into the actual process of mapping.
Okay. Sometimes there's a lot of care taken in the writing of a protocol, and people get out there and they forget to follow it, or they ignore it during the deployment of the loggers. But really not paying attention to the written protocol ends up causing a lot of rewrites for a final report, or even worse, a complete remapping of the space. So make sure you follow the protocol and make sure the placement of loggers are proper and documented. If a change is made from the proposed mapping layout, make sure that the change and the reason for the change are documented. Make sure that each logger can be identified. Identification can be completed any way you like, really. You can use your own internal numbering system or the serial device number, anything, so long as it's unique and it's documented to its location. Mapping failures for improper labeling happen quite often. Another big thing is make sure that the available memory of the device is big enough to handle the duration and logging rate of your mapping study. Incomplete data will result, and of course, again, a mapping failure can be likely. Also make sure that the loggers are active and logging. A data logger that is not running will not provide any data, of course, and so it's not a bad idea to periodically check the logger status if it's possible. And another common failure when deploying loggers is that the battery life is not checked before the deployment. And we're going to head into the preparing the mapping report. The mapping report should include the following sections: an introduction, description of the objectives of the mapping study, a summary, and discussion of the results organized in the sequence set out in the mapping protocol, including a summary of deviations, a general conclusion for all verifications and observations indicating the acceptability of the equipment for operation. Recommendations and remarks can be incorporated into this section as well. The last section of the mapping report should have an index containing the site survey showing the logger locations, the raw data, the spreadsheet data and related temperature graphs for every logger used in the mapping exercise, Raw results of the data analysis, including hot and cold spots. Key documents and notes prepared during the mapping exercise together with any other supporting material. Deviation reports, including corrective and preventive action forms. They can include recommendations for partial or total remapping. Let's hope that that doesn't happen, but it can from time to time. And then a very important thing is the calibration certificates for all the loggers that you've used. And some further notes about the mapping report. Once again, remember to use the data logging software tools as much as possible. Generating the reports from raw data will take time, especially for large spaces. You know, you can easily have 150, 100, or 150 loggers in use. So if you have that many, even uploading and downloading to them takes quite a bit of time. Many of the logging software packages also provide the graphing capabilities we talked about earlier, and that's a big thing that will really enhances your final report a lot. And graphing data through spreadsheet programs with that many loggers, again, can really be very frustrating and time-consuming. Remember to use the mean temperature analysis that might be available. And these figures can be compared between all the logger locations within the space. And this enables the analyst to identify the locations where the mean temperatures are consistently low or higher. An outcome that cannot be achieved simply by comparing individual data points. So make sure to include those mean, maximum, and minimum temperatures when you're doing your final report. The anomalies or the deviations should be noted. Not reporting data due to deviations or not highlighting and explaining those deviations can lead to a lot of problems for getting an approval. Recommendations and suggestions should be documented, even if the answer to this section is no changes required. So just to summarize before going into our final Q&A, I hope that our goal was to provide some information on some of the pertinent guidelines, some tips for preparing the mapping protocol and conducting mapping. Bruce, I'll turn it back over to you.
Okay, thanks, Steve. Good stuff. I hope everyone got some useful information to help you make your life a little easier when you have to map your next project. Katie, do we have some questions coming in from our audience?
We have quite a few. Our first one comes from Dwayne. He asks, will you please suggest a method for logger replacement, number, and locations?
Logger placement, I think it is, Steve.
The logger placement?
Yeah.
Yeah, it depends on the facility. In general, racks that are 10 feet tall usually has a minimum bottom and a upper on the rack. If it's under 10 feet, excuse me. If it's over 10 feet tall, then typically there's 3 used for 3-dimensional layouts. So there's a bottom, mid, and high point. The big question in mapping all the time is asked, you know, if my rack is 10 feet tall, but the building has a 20-foot height, there's 10 feet of space up above that rack. And that's kind of a gray area if you read through all these guidelines, in that, you know, if you're not storing product up there, is it really relevant? And it depends completely, again, goes back to what your product can withstand and proving that your temperature limits or humidity limits haven't gone beyond what's good for your product.
Dwayne follows up with, what is the best standard for determining logger placement?
You should really, if you're looking for a guideline, without a doubt, the best guideline is the WHO guideline. They spell out exactly what distances you should have. If you have a very, very large warehouse, this becomes quite a challenge because obviously the spaces are large and you know, you get into 100 loggers, 200 loggers, 300 loggers pretty quickly. But I would definitely use the WHO guideline. They do allow some variance for very large spaces. Instead of 10 to 20 meters, they might let you go as far as 60 meters. But again, it all depends on the situation. But check out that WHO guidance.
Our next question is it always necessary to map in winter and summer? Does it depend on the geography?
It doesn't depend on the geography so much as what your product limits are. So we've had customers that their product had a problem with heat, and it would degrade the product if the temperature was too hot, but they really didn't have a problem on the low end. And so they chose, and it was their choice, not ours, but they chose not to do a wintertime mapping.
Our next question is from Gadiel. Sorry if I mispronounced that. How do you determine the number of... Oh, we already addressed it. I'm sorry. Our next question is, for controlled temperature units, there is an empty chamber mapping and loaded mapping. How about warehouses?
Okay, good question. With equipment mappings in a chamber, many times you do the mapping empty. That's because it's very hard on the control system. It's actually harder on the control system to control a space that has no product in it. When you put product in it, it creates mass, which helps the temperature mapping. So the worst case or the hardest case is actually empty. Warehouse mapping, it's not like that at all. You have to, in the guidelines, specifically state that it has to be tested under the conditions in which you work, in which the warehouse operates. So they're doing a empty warehouse might be nice as far as checking if does my HVAC system work to begin with. That might be nice, but it's really not necessary.
All right. Jeff would like to know, do any health authorities specifically require seasonal mapping? If not, when do you need to or not to do this?
Again, it all comes down to your product and what the product is. If it's a health, guidance that you're looking for on that, again, what does your product, especially if it's going to be with human use, what does your product, where does it begin to lose its quality or its purity? So that's really the question. What can your product handle? And even if it's not for human use, the bottom line is that if it helps produce a better quality product, then it's probably worth doing.
Our next question comes from Dwayne. What is an appropriate method for the placement of monitoring sensors for the space based on the mapping data?
I'm assuming that Dwayne's asking if once you get the mapping data and you see your hot and cold spots for installing a permanent system, and what you want to do is find the hottest spot, the coldest spot, and place those worst case scenarios, some type of permanent logger or logging system at those locations. That would be the way to go, and now you've got some science behind why you put the loggers where you put them. Typically, if you're going to install a permanent system, you're going to, no matter what, you're going to want to put some that are in the, let's just say the bottom, middle, and top.
Our next question comes from Patricia. She asks, if storage racks are near loading docks, how do you determine how much mapping should be done with doors open versus doors closed?
Good question. If the warehouse is operating, then what you would do is run the mapping for, typically the industry does it for a week. It's not uncommon for people to do it for 2 weeks. If you use a good quality logger, you're going to notice when people open and close doors just from the temperature variations. You'll be able to tell. Of course, if you follow the WHO guidelines, you'll see that you need to place loggers near the doorways at a minimum, so you can catch these variations. If the warehouse isn't operating, then you're going to have to simulate it somehow. You just have to determine how many shipments you get in a day and for how long it takes to unload those trucks and open the doors and then close them again.
Okay, that looks like
All right, that's
sorry, Katie, that looks like the last question we've got for today. So just got a few more slides. We'll go ahead and wrap up. And if you would like to have more information about mapping, again, we've got about 7 documents at the Rotronic Academy, all about cGMP mapping and other resources. Just go to rotronic-usa.com/academy, and you can download 5 of those documents right from the webinar interface. Just look for that section that says handouts. There's 5 PDF documents. Just download them right now before we go ahead and wrap up the webinar. The next webinar is how to choose an environmental monitoring system. This one will be on Thursday, January 12th at 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. You can learn more about that and sign up at rotronic-usa.com/webinars. And finally, Steve wants to give a little short overview about the Rotronic monitoring system.
Yeah, just quickly, it's a quick pitch, I guess you'd say, but we do offer services to do temperature mappings or validation, and we also have some great new software that's come out in 2016, and it's RMS software, or Rotronic monitoring software, and this software can be accessed anywhere where you have a web-enabled device. So it's very nice if you were doing a temperature warehouse and it didn't happen to be on site, or perhaps 2 miles down the road. With this software, you could take a look in mid mapping to see how it was going from your desk or office down the street. All right, Bruce, turn it back to you.
Okay, thank you everyone for attending today. We appreciate you spending your time with us to learn more about how to map a warehouse. Hope to see you on future webinars. And if you have questions, please email us or check out the Rotronic website, and we'd be delighted to hear from you. Even if you have questions about mapping in general, we're happy to help there. And of course, if you have questions about the Rotronic products and the monitoring system, we'd be delighted to hear from you. Thank you, everyone.
Hey, Bruce, can you back up one slide for just a moment?
Sure.
I just want to stress that with that new software, you can go ahead and take a demo test drive, if you will. You go to rotronicusa.com/RMS, and we'll also be happy to come and give you a demonstration at your site as well. That's all I wanted to stress. Thanks, Bruce.
Sure. Thanks, Steve, and thank you everyone again. That'll conclude our webinar for today, and I'll leave this slide up for a few seconds in case you want to jot down the information.